The judge ruined the life of an innocent black man by trusting lies and a racist system. But when the truth came to light, his guilt became unbearable, while Daniel, stripped of his freedom, found the strength to change not only his own fate, but the system itself. My decision will shock even those who have seen it all. But let's start from the very beginning. On a sun-drenched July day, Daniel Brooks, a young black entrepreneur, stood before the court, feeling the heavy gaze of Judge Williams piercing through him. The courtroom was packed, yet it seemed as though he had been isolated from everyone present. Daniel's heart pounded in his temples like a hammer. Around him sat white people, jurors, lawyers, spectators, some watching his fate with contempt, others with cold indifference. They didn't see a successful businessman who had built his enterprise from the ground up. They saw only another black man standing trial. At the center of attention was Judge Williams, a white man with a piercing gaze that instilled fear in many. He was about 50 years old and had a reputation for being strict and principled, always adhering to the letter of the law. Compassion or leniency were not attributes he was known for. His face was hard and impenetrable, like granite, the face of a man who judged by the rules, not by fairness. When Williams raised the sentencing papers to his eyes, time seemed to stop. The courtroom was so quiet that Daniel could hear his own breathing, and somewhere in the corner, a chair creaked. Thoughts swirled in his head. This is a mistake. It has to be a mistake. But his heart tightened with the premonition of inevitable injustice. The judge cast a cold glance at Daniel, then at his lawyer, as if considering his final words. Everyone in the courtroom waited tensely. Williams straightened in his chair, and finally his voice, dry and harsh like autumn leaves, cut through the silence. For the crime committed, he began, pausing for a long moment. You are sentenced to 5 years in a maximum security correctional facility. Those words hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. A murmur spread through the courtroom, but to him, it was a muffled noise that held no meaning. His lawyer, young and inexperienced, turned pale and quickly began shuffling through papers, as if hoping to find something that could change the sentence. But Daniel already knew. The game was over. His chances of freedom and a future had been crushed in an instant. His mother, Clara Brooks, a 60-year-old black woman with gray hair, clasped her hands on the bench behind him, trying to hold back her tears. Her face, deeply lined by the weight of life, reflected both pain and resilience. Her son was innocent, and she knew it. She knew there were clear contradictions in the case, that his arrest and the charges had been orchestrated. But even with this knowledge, she couldn't stand against a system that saw only a criminal in her son. Daniel had been convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The indictment claimed he had been involved in a financial fraud related to his business. The evidence was highly questionable, and the prosecution's key witness was someone whose reputation and words had long been doubted. Yet despite this, the system turned against him. A man who was black and successful, something that for many seemed like a threat in itself. After the sentence was pronounced, he was led away in handcuffs. For a moment, Daniel glanced back, and his eyes met his mother's. She didn't cry, but her expression said it all. She believed in his strength, just as she always had. Several hours after the court session, Daniel found himself in his cramped cell. The walls were gray, cold, and stifling, much like the system that had condemned him. He sat on the bed, staring at the narrow window through which barely any light entered. The moments of the trial replayed in his mind over and over, but inside him, a fire was igniting. It was not just the pain of injustice, but also a growing resolve. He remembered his mother's words from the night before the sentencing. "You're strong, son. Never give up, no matter how dark it gets around you." Those words became his anchor. He would not give up. He would fight. He knew the truth was on his side. And one day, he swore to himself, he would prove his innocence, no matter how long and difficult the road ahead might be. 3 long years had passed since the prison doors had slammed shut behind Daniel Brooks. For him, this time had been a test not only of physical isolation, but also of inner struggle. Each day felt like an endless repetition. The same cold walls, the same gray faces of inmates, the same relentless routine. But despite it all, a fire burned inside him. A fire that kept him from breaking. The key to his resilience was his mother, Clara Brooks. She had been a symbol of strength and support in Daniel's life since childhood. Gray-haired, with wrinkles that told the story of her struggles and sacrifices for her family, she visited every week, bringing not only emotional nourishment, but also updates from the lawyer. Every meeting with his mother was a source of inspiration for Daniel. Despite her 60 years, Clara always seemed unbreakable to him. Her soft voice and deeply resonant words gave him the strength to keep going. She reminded him that the world outside the prison walls kept turning, and that his fight was not over. "We will get to the truth, son," she would say every time their brief meetings came to an end. "You're not alone. I'm with you, and we'll get through this together." However, neither the lawyer nor Daniel had yet found any significant flaw in the case that could lead to a retrial. Daniel spent his time on self-education, immersing himself in legal books in the prison library. The hours spent reading legal documents and court rulings felt like his only window into a world where he could regain control over his fate. One day, as he was leafing through the pages of yet another volume, Daniel stumbled upon information that made his heart race. He read about a case where one of the prosecution's witnesses had been caught giving false testimony at the behest of the police. The similarities to his own case were striking. This witness was the same person whose testimony had been the decisive factor in his conviction. Daniel froze, feeling adrenaline slowly course through his body. He began meticulously investigating every detail of his case. The deeper he dug, the more it became clear that this witness might have been bribed. But who had bribed him? And then he came across the name of one of the officers involved in his arrest. A policeman whose reputation had already been tainted by corruption scandals in the past. This was the thread Daniel had been searching for all this time. The next day, when his mother came for her regular visit, he shared his discovery with her. Clara, as always, was focused and supportive. She immediately contacted the lawyer, who began a new phase of the investigation. The lawyer, armed with Daniel's information, sprang into action. He checked every possible source and found confirmation that the witness had indeed been bribed by the very policeman who had acted under the orders of certain interested parties. This officer was already under investigation in another case, which provided a chance to tie him to the fabrication of evidence in Daniel's case. A month of tense waiting passed. Every minute felt like an eternity to Daniel, but now he sensed that he had a chance. A new motion to review the case was filed in court, and soon a hearing was scheduled. Daniel was returned to the same courtroom where he had been sentenced 3 years earlier. Judge Williams once again sat behind his stern wooden desk, his usual cold expression revealing no emotion. But this time, things were different. Daniel's lawyer, armed with new evidence, laid out his argument carefully and confidently. He presented the new facts, showing that the witness whose testimony had been crucial to the conviction had been bribed, and the entire case had been fabricated. He demonstrated how the officer who had arrested Daniel had already been implicated in similar crimes. The courtroom was packed again. Daniel's mother sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving her son. Her face was full of hope, her silent prayers for his freedom unceasing. As Judge Williams listened to the evidence, he nervously ran his hand across his forehead several times, struggling to hide his growing unease. When the lawyer finished, there was a pause. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Williams wrestled with what he had heard. Snatches of thoughts flitted through his mind. Was I wrong? He had never publicly admitted his mistakes, but more and more evidence pointed to the fact that he had been part of a great injustice. He cleared his throat, glancing from Daniel to the papers in front of him. A faint blush colored his face, and he felt a cold sweat trickling down his back. I was wrong, the judge finally muttered, his voice sounding hollow even to himself. Those words rang out like a confession that he had been a cog in a system that had proven unjust, a system he had once taken pride in. 2 years had passed since Daniel Brooks was released from prison. In that time, his life had taken a dramatic turn. He had become a national figure, known as one of the few who had stood up to the system and proven his innocence. His story exploded across the media, drawing the attention of not only activists, but also the general public, weary of the constant injustices emanating from the judicial system. Daniel had become a voice for those whose lives were shattered by false accusations, whose dreams were crushed by wrongful convictions. After his release, Daniel found a new calling, helping others who found themselves in similar situations. He established a foundation that provided legal and financial assistance to those unjustly harmed by the justice system. Every day, he met with people who, like him, had been trapped by the system. He shared his story, helped them fight against injustice, and offered hope. Each of his speeches was filled with the pain of his past life, but also with a deep belief that change was possible. One day, at a major conference on racial justice, Daniel stood before a massive audience. Thousands of people listened to his words, which struck deep in their hearts. He spoke about how the system had broken him, but despite everything, he had not given up. He talked about how important it was to fight for the truth, even when it seemed like the entire world was against you. His voice carried not only pain, but also hope for a better future. Meanwhile, in the darkened office of his chambers, Judge Williams sat in front of the television. He had accidentally switched the channel and saw Daniel's face on the screen. At first, he wanted to change the channel, trying to avoid the unpleasant memories, but something made him stop. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, making the judge's heart tighten. In every word, Williams heard not only the pain of an innocent man, but also a hidden rebuke directed at him. A shiver ran down his spine, not from fear, but from realization. Judge Williams had always prided himself on his career and his principles. He genuinely believed that he served the law, not prejudice. But now that the truth had come to light, he could no longer think that way. His confidence had collapsed. The mistake he made in Daniel's case had become a dark stain on his career, one so deep that it could no longer be ignored. Since Daniel's exoneration, Williams had been unable to find peace. He replayed that trial over and over in his head, reliving the moment he delivered the sentence. The image of Daniel in handcuffs, his gaze full of confusion and disappointment, haunted him at night. He saw that look in his nightmares. The judge, who once saw himself as a pillar of justice, now realized that he had become a destroyer of it. He had committed an injustice, robbing an innocent man of years of his life. Guilt was tearing him apart. Every time he sat at his desk to review a new case, his hand would involuntarily tremble. He could no longer trust himself. More and more often, he wondered how many other mistakes he had made in his career. How many lives had he ruined with his careless approach to justice? These thoughts plagued him constantly, but to admit this publicly, that would be professional suicide. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for over decades could collapse in an instant if he confessed to his mistake. On the other hand, living with this burden on his conscience was unbearable. Each day, the internal conflict grew stronger. Williams began to notice that he was losing focus more and more often at work. His colleagues and subordinates noticed his depressed state, but no one dared ask why. He spent more and more time alone, lost in his thoughts. The judge avoided social interactions with his colleagues and even stopped attending public events. He was lonely, for no one knew of his secret pain except him. One evening, as he sat in his office late at night, he accidentally turned on the television again. The screen displayed Daniel's face, the very man he had unjustly sent to prison. It was a live broadcast of a conference where Daniel was giving a speech. The words coming from Daniel pierced Williams's heart. "We cannot remain silent when we see injustice," Daniel said from the screen. "If we remain silent, we become accomplices. I believe that each of us can change the system, but it requires honesty, not just with the world, but with ourselves." These words cut Williams like a knife. Honesty with oneself. He realized that this was exactly what he had been missing these past 2 years. He had been running from his guilt, from the realization that he had made a mistake. But there was nowhere left to run. The thought echoed in his mind. If I don't admit my mistake, I will indeed remain an accomplice to a system that destroys lives. In that moment, Williams knew he had to change something. He could no longer live with this weight on his soul. His conscience demanded action. A month had passed since Judge Williams fully realized his mistake and decided to step out of the shadow of the guilt that had been haunting him. During this time, he had been gathering his thoughts, carefully considering every word he planned to say at a public press conference. It had been difficult for him to take this step. Not only was he about to admit his professional mistake, but he was also prepared to reveal his internal struggles and deep sense of guilt to the public. The day of the conference arrived. The hall was packed. Journalists, representatives of public organizations, activists, and human rights advocates all had gathered to hear the anticipated statement that had become the talk of the town. In the front rows sat people whose faces reflected a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Everyone expected something significant, but no one could have predicted just how impactful the statement would be. Judge Williams, who had always seemed like an unshakable pillar of the system, looked different today. His usually calm and confident expression had been replaced by something much more vulnerable. His face was pale, his hands slightly trembled, but his eyes were resolute. This was a man ready to admit his mistakes, despite the potential consequences. He stepped onto the stage, approached the microphone, and looking out at the packed hall, began to speak. His voice was shaky at first, but he quickly regained control. "I stand here today to admit my mistake." His voice echoed throughout the room. "I was part of a system that unjustly persecuted an innocent man, Daniel Brooks, and for that, I ask for forgiveness." These words instantly caused shock in the audience. A heavy silence fell over the room, as if everyone momentarily forgot to breathe. Few had expected such a candid admission from a judge whose career had been built on strict adherence to the law. Williams continued, "2 years ago, I handed down a sentence based on false evidence and testimony that had been fabricated. For years, I believed in the infallibility of the system, that each sentence was a triumph of justice. But in reality, I became an accomplice to injustice. I failed not only Daniel, but also myself. And for that, I'm prepared to take responsibility." His voice was filled with inner pain, as though each word cut into his soul. The crowd began whispering. Some were shocked, others angry. This was a moment where the boundaries between professional reputation and personal integrity blurred. To some, Williams had become a symbol of a broken system, while to others, he represented an extraordinary act of courage. Daniel Brooks was in the audience. He stood among the crowd, watching every movement of the judge. His heart tightened with conflicting emotions. He had never expected to witness this moment. The man who had once destroyed his life was now standing before the entire country, publicly acknowledging his guilt. It was more than Daniel could have ever imagined. His initial feelings were mixed: anger, bitterness, relief, and even a small measure of empathy. But one thing was clear: he couldn't remain indifferent. Williams continued, "I can no longer perform my duties as a judge, knowing that I made such a grievous error. I am resigning, effective immediately. I will do everything in my power to help reform the system that allows such injustices to occur. I know that my actions cannot return the time stolen from Daniel, but I hope that my admission can be the first step toward change." These words sparked intense discussion and even arguments in the hall. People didn't know how to respond to such a statement. Some admired his bravery, while others believed it was too little, too late, since the injustice had already occurred. After his statement, Williams slowly left the stage, feeling the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't complete relief, but the beginning of a long journey toward redemption. Daniel remained silent, processing what had happened. For the first time in a long while, he felt that the system that had once destroyed him might actually be starting to change. It was difficult to accept, but he knew that forgiveness was not a sign of weakness. It was a step toward healing. As he left the hall, he paused and looked at his mother, who had always been by his side, supporting him. Her eyes were filled with pride and hope. After this event, Williams's life changed drastically. He retired and began working with various organizations dedicated to justice reform. He became actively involved in initiatives aimed at improving the judicial system and fighting against the very injustices he had witnessed firsthand. He understood that his new mission was to ensure that cases like Daniel's would never happen again. Daniel, seeing this gesture, changed as well. He decided to forgive the judge, not because he felt obligated to, but because he understood that true justice lies not in punishment, but in change. He realized that in order for the world to become a better place, people had to change, admit their mistakes, and learn from them. And while the path to reform was long and arduous, the system was finally beginning to change. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but with small confident steps, people like Williams and Daniel were paving the way toward a future where everyone had the right to a fair trial and human dignity.